company 0x4447 builds products to increase standardization and security in AWS organizations. And they do this with automated pipelines that use well-structured projects to create secure, easy to maintain, and fail-tolerant solutions. One of those is their VPN product, built on top of the popular OpenVPN project, which has no license restrictions. You're only limited by the network card in the instance. To learn more, visit snark.cloud/deploy-and-go. That's snark.cloud/deploy-and-go, all one word.
I've been an advocate for AWS SSO for a while, but the official tooling used to log in and work with various accounts within your organization has been somewhat lacking, to put it mildly. That's why I was so pleased to stumble across Granted recently. Before I get into what it is and how it works, allow me to identify what my rather peculiar use case looks like. First, I have an AWS Control Tower managed organization for the Duckbill Group, replete with its AWS SSO access management. We have a bunch of accounts inside of that org that we can assume roles within, depending upon who we are and what we're up to. So far, so good. Second, I have a second AWS organization comprising a single account called Shitposting. I'm not making that up. AWS account aliases are globally unique, and for some odd reason, nobody at the register bothered to snap that one up, so I did. That's a completely separate AWS SSO installation to which I have to authenticate. Third, I have a variety of roles that I assume in client accounts. These never tend to last very long, as our engagements at the Duckbill Group are by design short-term, but any given client has anywhere from 1 to thousands of AWS accounts that will do bill analysis within. It's fun. We're increasingly rolling out automated tooling for a lot of it, but occasionally there's still no substitute for working directly with the resources inside of the account. Fourth, while I use a Mac at home, whenever I travel, I have a habit of only bringing an iPad with me. So whatever I use for account access has to also work within a headless EC2 instance. Fifth, I have a bunch of command line utilities that have no real conception of AWS account profiles and the like, but will pay attention to environment variables like AWS credential sets. Sixth, as much as I like to tout the benefits of doing everything via either the CLI or a variety of API calls, that is of course a lie. Lying is a foundational tenet of ClickOps, after all. Therefore, I need to be able to log into a number of different account AWS consoles, ideally without having to go through an obnoxious process of having to manage a whole mess of IAM usernames and passwords. Seventh, because it's a vast world and it takes all kinds, I do have a couple of legacy accounts that only support IAM credential sets. That basically covers it, as well as explains why I'm so sad all the time. So before this, I treated things a bit differently. Once upon a time, in previous jobs, I kept long-lived IAM credentials on disk because I was a dangerous fool. I now know that this was wrong and have taken steps not to do that anymore. It could have been worse. Those credentials might have been for the AWS root user. Please never do this. For a while, I've been using 99design's excellent AWS Vault. It stores IAM credentials in a local encrypted password store. On macOS, that's Keychain. On Linux, it uses the pass command, so you don't have to have long-lived credentials sitting around on disk. It's been good, but Granted is better. I've experimented with AWS SSO CLI, which, while excellent, ergonomically doesn't quite suit me. I've also, of course, used the official AWS CLI to log in via SSO, but, well, let's just say that while it's gotten better lately, it's pretty clear that someone on that AWS service team gets bonused based upon how many characters their customers type when working with the tool. So now I use Granted instead. I originally discovered Granted a month or so before recording this podcast. The delay was largely spent with me lobbing GitHub issues at their repository and obnoxious leading questions at their developers in their community Slack. There were a few strange issues, a few unsupported use cases for my lengthy list that I just went through, and above all, I wanted to get comfortable enough with it so as not to have to retract this podcast in 3 weeks after something better comes along. On a Mac, brew install largely gets you what you need after adding a tab. On Linux, wget a binary from their site and shove it into place is the current state of the art because I don't like Linux packaging either. Nobody does. It'll be fine. Keep listening.
Today's episode is brought to you in part by our friends at Minio, the high-performance Kubernetes native object store that's built for the multi-cloud, creating a consistent data storage layer for your public cloud instances, your private cloud instances, and even your edge instances, depending upon what the heck you're defining those as, which depends probably on where you work. It's getting that unified is one of the greatest challenges facing developers and architects today. It requires S3 compatibility, enterprise-grade security and resiliency, the speed to run any workload, and the footprint to run anywhere, and that's exactly what Minio offers. With superb read speeds in excess of 360 gigs and a 100 megabyte binary that doesn't eat all the data you've got on the system, it's exactly what you've been looking for. Check it out today at min.io/download and see for yourself. That's min.io/download, and be sure to tell them that I sent you.
It includes two commands, granted and assume. The former controls settings for the utility itself. It's worth pointing out that it, of course, respects the AWS configuration file in the user's home directory, so populating that with the roles I care about was a bit of a task. Ben Kehoe's AWS SSO util was helpful, though it did require a fair bit of tweaking to align with how I think about profile naming. Take a look into its AWS config file generation capability. It's great for generating a config file that a human being can get value out of. Granted lets you configure what browser you're using. Assuming you're not running a headless Linux instance, you're going to want to use Firefox for this. Spare me your I use Brave or Chrome or whatever for this one, because I'm not saying this because I'm a zealot. I'm saying this because Firefox's multi-container capability has been wrapped by the granted Firefox plugin. Keep listening. Once you've gotten it set up the way you want, type assume, followed by either the enter key or the name of a profile. If the former, you'll be able to select from all of the profiles in your AWS config sorted by a frequency algorithm. And yes, that's really a word, not me mispronouncing something for once, so that your most commonly used options appear near the top. Whack enter, and you'll either be kicked out to a browser to authenticate via SSO or be given a URL to standard out if that's how you've configured granted. So go sign in with your SSO credentials. When the login is successful, granted stores the token in its configured credential store. It's usually got a 12-hour validity window, so none of the IAM login every hour nonsense here. It also populates the usual environment variables in your terminal as you'd expect. Wait, it gets better. If you invoke assume with the -c flag, instead of setting environment variables, it will launch your default browser. And here's why you want it to be Firefox. It'll add the name of the profile to your URL bar in a unique color representing the container that it's in. You can thus have a dozen or more different AWS accounts logged into the web console simultaneously. For those of us who live and die by ClickOps, this is transformative. I'd advise users to also detect and display the value of AWS profile in your various shell prompts, lest you operate on an account you didn't intend to. And the ZSH tab completion isn't quite working for profiles the way I want it to yet, as of the time of this recording. That said, the developers behind the tool are friendly and accessible. The code is surprisingly readable for someone who's, until recently, never touched Golang in anger, and the documentation continues to get better bit by bit. Granted is to date the best means I've found to navigate a disturbing number of AWS accounts. If you know of a better one, I would dearly love to know what you've found.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.